Tomorrow is Yud Beis Tammuz, and Tuesday is Yud Gimel Tammuz. If I remember correctly, in Pei Zayin, that means 92 years ago, Yud Beis Tammuz was on a Tuesday, and Yud Gimel Tammuz on a Wednesday, because Gimel Tammuz was then on a Sunday, and this year Gimel Tammuz was on Shabbos. And of course, there's the famous story that the offices were closed, so we got 2 days Yom Tov, because there was a Chag. I heard a tape of the Rebbe telling the story that because that Tuesday was some kind of a holiday in Soviet Russia, so that he couldn't go officially. It went on Paltiel. So the next day he had to be told, so we have 2 days of Yom Tov, Yud Beis and Yud Gimel Tammuz. And of course the Rebbe also adds that Tezvav Tammuz is a Yom Tov, because that was the day he came home. It was Friday. Tezvav Tammuz was Friday. And the Rebbe holds that the halacha is that you can't say a goimu. You can't say a goimu when you go out of the jail until your chayzer leisane, till you go back to your regular place. So even though Friday there was no kriyas hatera, the kriyas hatera was Shabbos, but the possibility to say goimel was on Friday, Tezvav Tammuz, when he arrived home. So the Rebbe often would make a fabring in Yud Beis Tammuz, Yud Gimel Tammuz, and Tezvav Tammuz. It was considered a hemshech of Yud Beis Tammuz. And if I'm not mistaken, it's the yard site of the Eila Chaim HaKadosh. I think that 40 years ago, Lametes, I think, Tezvav Tammuz, if it's not Tezvav Tammuz, it's Tezvav Sivan, but I'm almost sure it's Tezvav Tammuz, is the yard of the Eila Chaim HaKadosh. And the Rebbe spoke about the Eila Chaim HaKadosh. I guess I should save it for later in the week. I'm actually going to check from Merenu Harav, Google. I will know in 1 minute. It's Tezvav Tammuz.
It's in Tammuz.
Okay. So yeah. It's if I know it's Tezvav. Tezvav Tammuz Tov Kuf Gimel. Tezvav Tammuz. And the Rebbe spoke about the Eila Chaim HaKadosh. And what's interesting about it is, it's very interesting. The Rebbe spoke about the Eila Chaim HaKadosh, things that the Frierdiker Rebbe never touched on. And I always was skeptical. You know, in the non-Chabad world, they placed the Eila Chaim HaKadosh on the same pedestal as the Baal Shem Tov. You know that? They make them equal. Shabbat b'Shabbat. I can't imagine anybody being equal to the Baal Shem Tov. I really can't.
Same contemporaries?
They were more or less contemporaries. The Eila Chaim passed away Tov Kuf Gimel. The Rebbe Baal Shem Tov passed away 17 years later. So the Eila Chaim was older. But in their world, in the Polish world, they talk about the Baal Shem Tov looking for a certain kavanah, and that only one person in the generation knows it. And when the Baal Shem Tov discovered the kavanah, that was his proof that the Eila Chaim HaKadosh passed away. I mean, they tell stories that Mamish made the Eila Chaim HaKadosh equal to the Baal Shem Tov, which is very difficult for me to digest. Now, my influence in the Frierdiker Rebbe doesn't just give the history of Hasidus, he gives the neshama of that history. He makes no reference to Eila Chaim. So the Rebbe said, I think it was 40 years ago, that even though the Rebbe the Shved didn't talk about it, but Chassidim tell the stories, and Mistama the stories are Rebbe's. Now, if you know anything about the Rebbe, the rule of thumb was that if the Rebbe the Shved didn't say it, it was the Mistama Nish Emes. And here the Rebbe took a different approach, where he agreed with these stories that they tell about the greatness of the Eila Chaim and his relationship with the Baal Shem Tov and the Maitos of Gershon Gittevet. There's a whole bunch of sipurim about the relationship with the Baal Shem Tov and the Eila Chaim. They never met. But the Baal Shem Tov's brother-in-law, Gershon Gittevet, went to live in Eretz Yisrael. And he joined the kibbutz of the Eila Chaim HaKadosh. He was a big makubal. He was a big tzaddik, he was a big gon, he was a big kaddish. And the Baal Shem Tov was involved with the Eila Chaim through his correspondence with his brother-in-law, with the Gershon Gittevet. For me, again, it's very difficult for me to imagine somebody that should be on the same level as the Baal Shem Tov. It just doesn't sound reasonable. And if Frierdiker Rebbe doesn't talk about it, so I just assume that this is Polish Shemaisis, you know. It's nice stories. True is one thing, nice is another. But then the Rebbe spoke this whole Fabrengen, where he said that even though it's not, the Frierdiker Rebbe didn't talk about it, Chassidim and Besibed erzählt, and it's Mistama Emes. So anyway, I want to learn Tanya. I don't want to talk about it. If I'm going to talk about Tezvav Tammuz, I'll do it on Tezvav Tammuz. I'll do it b'Yomim, whatever day of week that is. Now we're finishing Perek Ches, okay? We're finishing Perek Ches, which means that we're holding on page Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. Yud Gimel would be what? Page 25 in the Tanya. And we're holding 7 lines from the bottom of the page. Good morning. 7 lines from the bottom of the page. 7 lines from the bottom of page Yud Gimel Amud Aleph, or page 25, whichever is easier for you. 25 is opposite 24. Okay, that would work. The English numbers are on the right side of the page, the Hebrew numbers on the left side of the page, and every Hebrew number is half of the English number. That's just how it works. The last 3 prakim, Vav Zayin Ches, are talking about Klippah, just like prakim Beis Gimel Dal Hey talked about Kedusha. Vav Zayin Ches talk about Klippah. And when he talked about Kedusha and Beis Gimel Dal Hey, there were 2 basic discussions. Basic is a big bad word, but I'm allowed to use it when I choose. Okay? 2 basic discussions. The first is what is the neshama, and the second, what happens when the neshama interfaces with Torah mitzvahs. So when you get to Vav Zayin Ches 6, 7, and 8, and now you're talking about the Nefesh HaBamis, because of the principle of Zel Umazeh, you have to presume that the Alter Rebbe does the same thing. A, he talks about what the Nefesh HaBamis is, and B, he talks about the interface between the Nefesh HaBamis and Klippah. And I think that's accurate. I think that's true. But the distribution of ideas is very different. In other words, the amount of time the Alter Rebbe spent defining the Nefesh HaLokis is much more than the amount of time the Alter Rebbe spent defining the Nefesh HaBamis. Defining the Nefesh HaLokis was more than 2 prakim in a page. Defining the Nefesh HaBamis is maybe a page, half a page, 3/4 of a page, that's it. But quantity is not the issue. He defined what the Nefesh HaBamis is, the design of the Nefesh HaBamis. Sheva midas rois v'seichel ha'melidan. I don't want to tell you what that means because I want to learn weiter. And then he immediately began to discuss what happens when the Nefesh HaBamis meets Klippah. There's something called Klippas Nege. There's something called Klippas Tmeyes v'rois lagamri. And there's different involvements between a Yid in Klippas Tmeyes v'rois lagamri, depending whether it's a Klippas Noiga, which was Yedid Levisha, to Klippas Tmeyes v'rois lagamri, or it's Klippas Tmeyes v'rois lagamri itself. Perek Ches, chapter 8, is a bunch of individual ideas connected to that thing, but in a way it almost seems like it's pieces. It's like footnotes. Now that we discussed it, I want to tell you this, and I want to tell you this, and I want to tell you this, and I want to tell you this. The first thing the Alter Rebbe talked about in Perek Ches is food. That even though there's a lot of klippos, there's something very distinctive about not kosher the food, because it becomes one with the person. And the Alter Rebbe argues that not kosher the food that was ingested is not, you can't get it out. It's very difficult to get out. It's very unusually binding to the person because it becomes one with the person. And then the Rebbe started talking about different processes of cleansing or of punishment, depending on what world you come from. Chibut HaKever, Kafakela, and Gehenna. For Avedas, you go to Gehenna. For things that are less than Avedas, so there's, depending on what the diminished, the chesaron is, there's either Chibut HaKever or Kafakela. And to explain it in different words. To explain in different words what we did, I mean, we haven't learned last week, we haven't learned the week before, and it's possible, it's been a while since we learned Tanya, because I was pushed away, I wasn't here. The spirit of it is this. Like I said, when the neshama comes l'mayla, you could look at what happens to the neshama as being punished, and you look at the neshama as being cleansed, and to a great extent it's a perspective. To a great extent, whether you look at what happens to a neshama when it, so to speak, goes to the other side, whether you see it as purging, or you see it as refining and raising up, is a perspective. And I saw some place, and I'm not able to find it now, where the Rebbe writes that oftentimes the difference between one cleansing and another cleansing is how you experience it. In one constant, in one context, you know you're experiencing a cleansing, but you know it's cleaning you. Then when a person is being cleaned and you know it's cleaning, he's happy about it. And in another context, the person goes through the exact same cleansing, but he doesn't know that it's cleansing, so it's very painful. That's a part of the dynamic, it's a part of the story, if you will. But the oimek shebedova, the depth of it is the great disparity there is between the material world and the spiritual worlds. And this is very, very difficult to figure out in practical life. It's very difficult to be at peace with. And I'll tell you what that is. In the physical world, we think in terms of good and bad. In the spiritual worlds, we think in terms of pure and impure. And they're very different concepts. Good and bad means, is this a bad thing? I won't do it. If it's not a bad thing, why can't I do it? In the world of pure and impure is, if it's pure, I want an association. If it's not pure, why would I want to touch it? So on one extreme, you have bad, yeah. The other extreme, you have pure. In between the two, you have a big array, a big area, where things are not bad, but they're also not tahir. And in Elam Hazeh, in this world, for the average person to concern himself, to be sensitive to involvement in only things that are tahir is incredibly challenging. It's very difficult. And it's, for many people, push it above their station. You know, if a person is going to sit and do a skafi like he did 150 years ago, 150 years ago they ate bread, you understand? That's what they ate. They didn't live in our society. Yeah? A person is going to concern himself today, unless you're a very special person, with the skafi, you'll literally drive yourself mad. You'll have a breakdown. It's Meshuggah. Because it's not Leviat Kenu, at least not Leviat most of us, or many of us, or some of us. And this is the story. A neshama in this world obviously doesn't want to do bad things. But the neshama in this world is taught. This is chapter 6, Berivav. That in the world in which you live, since you think of good and bad, you don't worry about things that aren't bad, even if they're not pure. But in the world from which the neshama came, and the world to which the neshama is going to return, if it's not pure, it's bad. It's a very, very different reality. So a very significant part of the cleansing that happens to a neshama when it leaves this world is not about the bad. It's about the impure. It's not bad things. But legabi elmis al yoinim, compared to the kind of realities a neshama has on high, where there's no goof, it's an interference. It's a tumah, and it has to be cleansed. And that's why you have all of these steps. Kafakela and chibit hakeva, kafakela again. And there's an expression that denotes it. There's an expression that represents it. That expression is, and I know this from the Maimorim, this doesn't say Tanya, but it says in Chassidus, Lishkach chizu dahayam. When a neshama comes into a higher world, has to forget how this world works. Has to completely forget how this world works. Because as long as you remember how this world works, there's such a conflict between the best of this world and the higher worlds that it interferes. In other words, the person is going to experience ruchnius. The state of tahara that they need is such that it's not only that they're pure, that they have no sense of how things are in this world. You know the famous story? Now there's a book that's called The Third Judge. I think it's called The Third Judge, yeah. It's based on the story. The story is of Folakan's Mises. It's not in the Rebbe Sichis, but it's one of the stories that Folakan, Zeichen Gewesnas, is it's one of those stories that everybody tells. You know the story of The Third Judge? The story of The Third Judge is again, this is in the Folakan's Mises. It's, in other words, it's not from Rebbe. It's from Chassidim. And again, like the Rebbe always says, Chassidim, I just told you before about the Chassidim were very concerned with every hege, every word that came out of the mouth of their Rebbe. And therefore, when a Chassid transcribes, even though Shkias mi Yavin is only a person, you have to presume that because they were so concerned that they should give over the Divrei Harav the way they are, you can assume that they're saying them correctly. The Rebbe writes this in the Hakdam of the Sefer Teres Shalom, which is really the first Krach of Sichas that was published here in America, to explain why he's publishing Hanochas Bilti Muge, unedited transcripts of Sichas from the Rebbe Rashab, what Teres Shalom was at that time. It was the first, as far as I remember, the first Krach of Sichas ever printed. And that applies to all. The story with the third judge is Tzemach Tzedek came to Lubavitch. And they asked the Tzemach Tzedek to say Chassidus. And the Tzemach Tzedek came out, the way I remember this often, he came outside. In a city like New York, you can't imagine anybody talking in the street. But in a shtetl like Lubavitch, it was as quiet outside as it was inside. The only thing you had was the mosquitoes flying around. And he got up on the bimah, and he said to the Chassidim, "He will tell Chassidus tziyamais." Would you prefer a chassidus or a story? You know this story. So the chassidim understood from the question that they should say a mais. So Tzemach Tzedek told the story about the two, wie ist the name? Rabbi Yankiv, right? Yankiv Tam and Rabbi Yankiv, where there was a landlord and a tenant. And the tenant didn't pay rent 1 year, and a second year, and a third year, and the landlord wanted to kick him out. So the tenant went to the Gerushin Rebbe, the Tzaddik Gerushin, and the Gerushin had gebeten, and he forgave him. Eventually, the landlord wouldn't hear of it. Thank you very, very much. Thank you very much. The landlord wouldn't hear of it, and he kicked him out. And the tenant died of heartbreak. And the tenant of Gemot, Shechas Damim, he caused a loss of life because of a few dollars. So when the landlord passes away, there's a dintayre. The tenant is calling him a murderer. And the landlord says, I'm a murderer? I'm the most shameless, most benevolent man on the weekend. 3 years if I could rentum this. But you caused the premature death of a person. So they're a dintayre. Who's going to sit in the dintayre? They got Yidden, whose neshamas had been in the 12 generations before. And they said, guilty, guilty, guilty. Forget about it. So the landlord, Tanya, they forgot what money is. So they brought going in just from one generation before. And it says the names, I think, of who they were. And they sat on the case, and they said, guilty, guilty, guilty. And the landlord said, they also forgot money. And the Tzemach Tzedek finally says, Ich zog zakai, wo zogt ihr? I say not guilty, what do you say? And they understood that they were the Bezdin. What's the shot? And Neshama leaves this world, it forgets what money is. Could you imagine not knowing what money is? A person gives somebody else 3 years free rent and then kicks them out. They're a nice guy, no? I mean, unless you're the one being kicked out, I suppose. Yeah. But Lemailo, what's a maisa? A pardola. You know that the Mittel Rebbe did not know Tzuras Mabei. It says in all the story, the Mittel Rebbe could not understand money. The Mittel Rebbe was such a genius. The Frierdiker, first of all, the Rogatchover said about the Mittel Rebbe that the Alter Rebbe is given a God, or the Mittel Rebbe is Ga'an HaGoin. The Rogatchover said that the Alter Rebbe was a God, and the Mittel Rebbe was Ga'an HaGoin. Would you imagine? The Rogatchover said that the Mittel Rebbe was a greater God than the Alter Rebbe. The Frierdiker Rebbe says in the Siches, quote, this is a direct quote, the Mittel Rebbe's Moichin, wer kennt, which means in English, the intelligence of the Mittel Rebbe, who can fathom it, who can relate to it. Friedrich Rebbe writes about the Mittel Rebbe, the Mittel Rebbe's Moichin, wer kennt das? Understand between the Mittel Rebbe's cup. And he didn't understand the difference between a 1 ruble note, a 10 ruble note, a 100 ruble. He couldn't get it. And the famous joke was, when the Tzemach Tzedek became a Rebbe, the Balagos came to the Chassidim and said, there is a felshit. He's a phony Rebbe. Because the Seder was in the old country that when you went with a wagon, you paid the Balagol. But one of the, I don't know what you would call perks of the trade was that every time you stopped in an inn, you gave the Balagola a coin for a drink, a bitter trappen, an alcoholic drink. It was a tip. It wasn't part of the pay. This was the culture. The Mittel Rebbe gave the Balagola, he never asked him for change. Sometimes he gave him a 1 ruble note, a 10 ruble note, a 100, because the Mittel Rebbe took for nothing good. Tzemach Tzedek used to ask for change. He said, this is a Rebbe. The Mittel Rebbe just kills my baby. Do you imagine a Yid, such a moyach, and he couldn't understand money. It was beneath him. So this is the concept of Lishtaka Chidit, the Pashut forget Elam Hazim. And that's what these processes achieve. Chidit HaKever and Kafakel and Gein, and they bring the person to a different world. Before I came here today, I listened to a little bit of the class I gave you, whatever it was, 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I quoted the Gemara. The Gemara says, it's worth going through the din to come to Amados. The Gemara says this. Because, and you have to go, you're going from one reality into an entirely different reality. It's so different that if you're on the other side, you can't relate. You have no sense of how this reality works. You just don't understand. You can't have a chush whatsoever. This is what we learned. And there was a number of examples. Pater, and so on. We're at the end of the page. The last issue which Alter Rebbe talks about is Chochmas Chitzenius. Okay? Because the Alter Rebbe is discussing Alter Rebbe is discussing the effect that Klippas Nega has on a person. We're not talking about, see, this is the deal. We're not talking about evil. We're talking about not pure. And if you could remember, when we started this sequence of Prabhu, we started Pedig Vav in the very beginning, I made a point then to introduce the language of Tumah and Tahara, which is in the Tanya. The Tanya, you know, people learn Tanya their whole life, they sometimes don't even see this. The Alter Rebbe uses the word Tomei and Tahara often. He doesn't only use the word Klipa, because Taiv and Ra, good and evil are black and white. Tomei and Tahara are very different, because something doesn't have to be black to be Tomei, it just has to be not Tahara. And in the Tanya, Klippas Nega is not Ra, but Klippas Nega is not Tahara evil. Klippas Nega is in the middle. Klippas Nega is Tumah. And Tumah leaves a mark, and the mark has to be removed. But it's not the kind of mark that warrants Gehenna because it's not Ra. It's the kind of mark that marks some kind of cleansing, because in Gan Eden you can't have Tahara. When I was in yeshiva, they tell the story with Rabbi. This is the story that all the Bachim used to hear from their mashpiyim, which was a way of deflecting their responsibility onto their students, which unfortunately I am in the business of doing now myself. That Rabbi was sitting in Fabring. I heard this many times. We're sitting in Fabring with the Bachim, and I'm sure this word goes back generations. And Rabbi was talking to the Bachim about learning. Rabbi Khan is 89 and a half years old. So as Meinach Yom B'Shonim Zayin Naklodakok, and continue giving us the Mayan Amalgab of Tedes HaRebbe, which is what his Metzias is. Rabbi is a very moody man. When he's on, he can give a shit every day. And when he's off, he won't give a shit in 5 years. This is the way he operates. He was sitting with the Bachim, and this was during one of the moods where he was off. And he was talking to the Bachim about learning Chassidus. So the Bachim said that Rabbi will give Shiyurim, we'll learn Chassidus. So Rabbi said to him, "It's coming in Gan Eden, coming Lamaila." When they fragt, "What bist du?" They can ask you, "Say Chabad Chassid?" Yeah? You learn Chassidus? He says, "No, it's not my fault. Rabbi didn't give a shir. That's why I didn't learn." He said, "Neshikin in Gan Eden." They'll come into Gan Eden, everyone is looking at you. So why are you looking at me? The panim is schwarz. Your face is black, and usually black faces are not here, they're in the other place. He says, "Yeah, it's not my fault. It's Rabbi Yel's fault. That's the punchline. But your face is going to be black. That's the mashpia word, you understand? So you have cleansing, which is not about the ra, evil, which is the opposite of good, but about tumah, which is the opposite of tada. It's much more subtle, which is why I talked about dvarim b'tel mahatem. Stam ga'red. A person speaks words. They're not lashon hara, it's not techil, it's not meitzi shemra, it's not litzonis, it's not bittul teira, because it's not mechuyev in talmud teira. But you can't call it tahara. Ra it isn't, but tahara it isn't either. So it's that in between category which we're using the word tumah. And Gehenna you don't need, but cleansing you need. And the same is true enjoying dvarim hamutarim he brings. Enjoying dvarim hamutarim is not aveda. The ra it isn't, but tahara it isn't either. And in this light, the Rebbe talks about the limud of Chochmas Chitzenius. Okay, and of course, Chochmas Chitzenius has Dvarim Asurim. Chochmas Chitzenius has Treif, which is Treif, Tzrach, evil. And then Chochmas Chitzenius has a lot. Yet the best, I guess the most precise example would be mathematics. Mathematics is not evil. But in math, there's no God. You understand? There's no room in mathematics for the Eibishter. It doesn't exist. So b'meila it's not Tahara. It's called Chochmas Chitzenius. It's a chokhmah that the entire body of wisdom is without God. It's outside. There's no room in that chokhmah for the Beit Yelu and Higi. The chokhmah is very self-contained. It's very precise. It's very sophisticated. It's very profound. And the Eibush is outside of it. Lebar. That's why it's called chitzonius. And the same is true the way you study physics and chemistry and biology to understand it on the physical level. In no dimension is it necessary to have the Eibishter. I told you the famous quote from the 19th century thinker, I forgot whether he was a biologist or whatever he was, who said, "In my model there's no need for God. Rachmana litzlan. My model is good without the Eibishter." But there's nothing without the Eibishter. The Eibishter is outside. He's separate from it. He created the model, but you don't see his fingerprint. You don't see his presence inside the model. That's called Chochmah Chitzonius. Chochmah, which is outside. The Eibishter is not inside the Chochmah. The Eibishter is outside the Chochmah. It doesn't make it Ra. If it's a Vedazor, it's Ra. If it's a Pekursis, it's Ra. Even if it's Shituf, if it's duality, Shnius, That the Eibishter is also Ra. But not every Chochmah is Ra. But Tahara it's not. And therefore it's Tumah. So let's read now, okay? V'chein ha'oisik b'chochmas u'mes ha'elam. Now in your time, as the Bible says, right? In my time, it says u'mes ha'elam. This is a correction from the censor. And I am not so sure they should have put the corrections into the text. The Rebbe put the corrections in the back of the book. He could have put them into the Sefer if he wanted to. But in the printed Tanyas, it never says the word u'mes ha'elam. It always says akum, which means pagans. And of course this is because of censorship, because in Russia they censored Svardim, and they were not happy when you spoke about them in disparaging ways. So they would say, if you ever seen old Svardim, if you have ever seen old Svardim, I'm not a collector of old Svardim. I don't know what to do with them, I don't know how to value them, I don't want to have to worry about them, so I don't buy them. I don't have them, but I've seen them. And the inside of the inside of the title page, is 2 or 3 lines, that every place in this Sefer, where it's going to make a reference to non-Jews, this means the Goyim who lived hundreds of years ago. Who were the Zara, that means this, but today's Goyim are such wonderful people. And there was never a greater lie told, you understand? They had so many tzadis in Russia, tzadis you didn't have. And every Sefer, they had to put this disclaimer at the beginning of the Sefer. And throughout the book, they had to be careful. The way the Svardim works is you have to pre-censor. If you gave a Sefer to a censor uncensored, they just would disallow it. So you had to anticipate what would bother them, and you would make the corrections before they saw the Sefer. You understand? So, but here it says, by me it says u'mes ha'elam, but that's the correct version. Chochmas u'mes ha'elam. It doesn't mean chochmas avodah zarah, because avodah zarah is evil. Chochmas ha'umes, goyish ha'chochma, what the Chazal say, chochma yesh ba'goyim tamid, it's not ra, it's not evil. But it's not tahara either. There's no eibishter in it. And that's why it's tumah. One who's preoccupied with the chokhmah of u'mes ha'elam. We're not talking about a chokhmah that a Jew is not allowed to learn. We're talking about a chokhmah which a Jew is allowed to learn. But kedusha it's not. Says the Rebbe, bichlal dvarim b'teilim yechoshev le'inyan b'tel teira. It's part of dvarim b'teilim. What does that mean? Idle words. It's not sinful words. It's not evil words. But it's not pure words either. It's impure words. The inyan of and bittul teira, in as much as the sin of bittul teira is concerned. So here you have a subjective measure. Why? Because the rule is, there's a klal in halacha. It says in Gemara all over the place. Mitzvahs are not personal, not subjective. Everybody has to wear the same film, put the same mezuzah, eat the same kazai. It's not subjective. If you're frum, you eat a bigger piece. That's a mishagas. That's not a frum guide. A shear is a shear. There's 2 exceptions. Talmud Torah and Stock. Talmud Torah and Stock, there's a shear. But the shear has to do with your capability. If you're richer, you have to give more. If you're poorer, you have to give less. If you're able to, you have a chiyuv of learning Torah 24 hours a day. If you're not able to, there's a chiyuv of perek yechad yom, perek yechad layla. And as you know, women are part of Talmud Torah. They learn Torah, but they don't have a chiyuv of Talmud Torah. So there's different shiurim. So when a person is involved in chokhmas u'umes, it goes into the category of bittul Torah, but it goes into the category of bittul Torah based on what that person's condition is vis-a-vis bittul Torah. For a person who could learn Torah yom v'layla, it's an aveda. It's evil. But for other people who can't learn Torah, evil it's not. But you cannot call it tahir, because that's the definition of chokhmah chitzonius. Inside the chokhmah, there's no eibishter. That's the meaning of the word chitzonius. You have a body of knowledge which is very sophisticated, incredibly sophisticated, and very thought through and very precise. And there's a very, very strict criteria for how you measure things and how you determine things and how you fix things and how you establish things. It's a brilliant chokhmah. And the Eibush there's no need for the Eibush. It's self-contained. It exists entirely by itself. That's what's called chitzonius. So Ra, it's not, but Tahara it isn't either. So for one Yid who has a chiv of a gita v'yem v'alayla, it's bittul Torah mamish, and for another Yid it's dvarim b'teila b'heter, which the Alter Rebbe said earlier, the Einish, whatever it is, chiv b'takeva, kafakel, I forgot. But then the Rebbe continued. The age says there's another factor, that Yisera Tumasa. Notice the word Tumah. Notice the word Tumah. there is an additional tumah. And of course, the reason that Alter Rebbe uses the word tumah is because he wants to underscore that it doesn't have to be ra to be tameh. It has to only not be toiv, only not to be tohiv, to be tameh. Shal chochmes v'umes of the wisdom of umes of goyim. Al tumas dvarim b'teilim, over the tumah of idol of stam narishkeit, which is not an aved. Why? Because when a person engages in dvarim b'teilim, she'einei malbish u'metam, one's neshama becomes a garment for, and is therefore affected in a way that's called tumah. When he engages in idle chatter, in narishkeit, that nonsense. Yeah, when I was growing up, there was a word which you almost never hear anymore. Geplappelt. It's a Yiddish word. When there's an Aramaic in the Gemara, you have an expression. Pitpute mini bialma. Pitpute and geplappelt is not the same Shadish, but it's the same meaning. It's words. Harmless, empty words. That's what we're telling about. And so therefore it affects the emotions. Why? Because usually when you speak narishkeit, when you speak it passionately, people have, it's interesting to me, people can carry on very passionately about the most meaningless things in the world, over mamish. And you're listening, you can't believe an adult person can take this so seriously, and you don't realize that you got your interests. And when it comes to the things that are important to you, you can be just as preoccupied. You can be just as vakoch. When I was a kid growing up, there was a Yid who was a roach killer. What do they call those things? An exterminator. But as a chazegi kocht in the bugs, it was his world. And he came to yeshiva to spray, and he would talk to us about the different kinds of insects. It was entertaining to us to see how he wasn't doing extermination. He was an exterminator. You understand the difference? It wasn't a shem al-mushal, that was his mahus, was insects. So one person does it because he has to make a living. Another person does it. God licked it, like the famous lashon from the Hebnish Masayid, that kop and kaloshen. The head is narishkeit. But because it's narishkeit, the brain is not involved. It's hot. It's metame, not ra, but metame the life. Which is miyasei da ruach hara shabakli pezu benefesh habamis, from the element of ruach, which is evil. Evil, which was before in Perikal, in chapter 1, when the Alter Rebbe talked about the etzem of the nefesh habahamis being comprised of eish ruach maimenov. V'lei bechinas chabad shebenafsh. It does not contaminate the chabad, the mind. Why? Turn the page, page 26 now. Because since it's foolish, it's empty. Shtus means foolish, and Buddhist means substanceless. It's fools and ordinary people, simple people, unintelligent people. Yechel Medaber came could be engaged with this, so it's taked v'adam b'teilim. It's not an aveda. Ra, it's not. B'tahara, it isn't either. So it goes into the category of tumah. And for tumah, which is not ra, you don't need gehenim, you need chibat hakever hakafakela, as we discussed in the weeks past. But when a person learns chokhmas v'teinis, did you see the clip from, someone has to help me with his name, Dennis Prager? About 2 months ago, it went around on the WhatsApp. Dennis Prager is a Jew who grew up through, I think, like Talushkin, and like this guy that they just made famous in Sefer Torah, who lives in Connecticut, Dershowitz. They all have an Orthodox background, but unfortunately they're not through. This guy Dennis Prager is one of the strongest voices in America. He's a Jew. One of the strongest voices in America for what they call politically conservatism. He's about God and morality and traditional values. He's a very powerful man. He's very articulate and decisive. He takes a stand. And he's had incredible longevity. You know, a lot of these guys come along, they get batted around. He's been doing it since I'm a bocher. He's doing it 35 years at least. Maybe 40. But unfortunately, he's not ashamed of the mitzvah. Sometimes he is. It bothers. It's very upsetting that a person like this is kliga fadnebishn. But that's what happens when you're very smart. Dennis Prager did on one of his programs 2-3 minutes. He talks about Lubavitch all the time. I mean, at this point, everybody talks about Lubavitch. Lubavitch is it. And he says, I meet these rabbis who are the followers of Rabbi Schneerson. He says, and I found out that the rabbi was against people getting college education. And when I heard it the first time, he says, I thought, what kind of Hindish mention? How backwards, how primitive, how arcane, not to get a college education. He says, and then I meet them. And they're erudite, I don't know what that word means, but it's a good word, and intelligent, and informed, and articulate. He says, and the rabbi turned out to be right. That's what he says. The rabbi turned out to be right. Because Dennis Prager went on this whole thing that you send your kids to college, not to learn a trade, not to get educated, to be contaminated with the Mishigasim, with shiflus, the law of what the Rebbe spoke about. It's. And you hear a person from that world say the rabbi was right. You don't need a college education to learn a mensch. Look at them. They live in Katzvei Tevel. They know what's going on. They can speak and explain themselves clearly, and they were not contaminated by the. It's not the learning that goes out of the university. It's the. There's a word for it. The activism, the right that professors at universities have to teach people right and wrong. Right and wrong you learn from your parents. Right and wrong you learn in your church, not in the university. So I want to say this. I'm saying this as a teacher. It happens in our moistness. That a kid goes through school, that I'm not going to assign blame. I'm not going to say why. I'm just going to say the what. You can be very intelligent and never feel stimulated intellectually. You can go through the entire system. You can be preschool and then 8 grades of primary school and then 4 grades of secondary school and even beyond, and never feel like your mind was challenged. And then you go to college. And it's exciting. And I'm not talking about the Tum. I'm talking about the Chochmah. Now, it's criminal. It's terrible that a kid should learn in yeshiva and not be stimulated. Because the greatest Chochmah of the world is Torah. No question about it. I remember when I was a Bachayet, I met a boy who was a medical student. And he said to me, one Tosfos is more difficult than everything I'm learning. One Tosfos. The learning in yeshivas is the most intellectually stimulating and focused. Nothing teaches you how to think better than Torah. But if it didn't happen, it doesn't matter why. You go away to that world and you say, hey, I like this. Do you understand what's happening to this person? They're associating Torah with tipshis and Chochmas chitzenius with stimulation, with Chochmah. So that person's worldview, Welterscheinung, is built on an attitude that the religious education is me'echetes, it's marshmallows. And lahavlis, secular education is chochmah mitas. It's tragic because it's untrue. But it's one of the sakonis, and I know it from my own students, boys and girls. You have kids who are not so bright. They go to college and just sit in a piece of paper. They don't take the chochmah seriously, and it washes over them like a wave. It never happened. Then you have the kids who are and if they have any shaykhs with chassidus, so they know the place of chochmah chassidus. But then you have the children who are in between those two, and it's very difficult to know who they are. They went to school and their brain was never triggered. Maybe their heart was triggered. But their brain, no teacher ever got them to realize the chokhmah which is in Torah. And they go off and they learn whatever nonsense they're learning, and it wakes up their mind, and they associate seichel with tumah. They associate seichel with klipa. It's a sakona amitis. What's a sakona amitis? They're going to have children. What are they going to teach those children? You want to be smart. This is where smarts is. And it's a reality. It's a significant part of the reason, or a significant aspect of the Rebbe has many objections to B'chlal learning Chochmas Ketzenis, especially going to an organized college. There are many different sakonas that are lower than this, but this is a sophisticated sakona. When you go to school, your mind is triggered, and you, wow, this is fun. For smart people, using your brain is fun. And if you didn't get that in Torah, you have a worldview that puts Torah underneath. That's bad. And the Alter Rebbe here in our Pedic is saying, this is the difference between Reden Narishkeit and Reden Chochmas Chitzenius. When you speak Narishkeit, it's Narish. Narish is Narish. It's not exactly sophisticated, it's not self-honoring, but it's Metama Omidalev. It doesn't affect the mind in an adverse way. Chochmas Chitzenius is Metama de Moyach. It's a different kind of a sakona. And part of the reason it's a sakona is because you never think of the idea of contaminating the mind. Contaminating your heart, you understand. We call it lust. Tiger. How do you contaminate your mind? I mean, just no information. I understand stuff. And the answer is because the ego is involved. And what you do with your mind affects your ego. Your ego is your personality. Your ego is your mahus. And it reaches into your ego in a much deeper way. Let's read inside, okay? Says the Rebbe, 3 lines into page 26, the Gimel base. As opposed to the Chochma of Umeis, says the Rebbe, who malbish u'metame, one is investing and contaminating. Also the Chochma bina v'das of the divine soul. Notice the repeated use of the word Tumah. Because we're not dealing here with Chochma Asura. We're not talking here about learning about Avodah Zarah. We're not here about talking about what they call comparative religion. The worst thing a Jewish boy or girl can learn in college is Jewish religious studies. The worst! Yeah, but I'm going to school to learn. I learned yeshiva. Do you know what they do to Jewish religious studies? There's no God. No God. The most respectable way they oppose Jewish religious studies is history. That's the most respectable way. And we take history out of it. In other words, how it all evolved and developed. I can't tell you what to think of it. And a Jewish boy can study anything in the world. Don't study Jewish studies. Become a lawyer. Don't study. Because it's mamish ra. That's not tumah. That's ra. But even if it's only tumah, it's metama de moyach. Says the Rebbe, u'metama b'chein chabad shebenafshei halikis, it contaminates. The Chochma bina das the divine soul, betumas klipas nega, the tum of klipas nega, shebechochmas elo come from the Chochma, shenaflu sham, that those Chochma fell, b'shviras hakelim, and the kelim shattered, mebechenas hacherayim, shechochma kedusha, from the rear of Chochma of kedusha, ki yadua l'yedei, as it's known to the people who understand Chochmas HaKabbalah. The vart bekitzer or beklal is here, that all Chochma starts from Torah. But Chochma is a Chochma Pnimis. Torah is a Chochma Pnimis means you can never learn Torah from a worldly point of view. You can only learn Torah from a divine point of view. So even when you're learning about the world, as you're learning about the world in the Torah, you hear the world in as much as the Eibush as its creator. You don't hear world as such. Welt als Welt. And in Chochmas Chitzenius, you hear about the world in such a way that it's disconnected from HaKadosh Baruch Hu altogether. How novel. The Chochmas Umis came from Chochmas HaTorah. The knowledge that comes from the Goyim, I'm talking about real Chochma, comes from Chochmas HaTorah, but it comes from Chochmas HaTorah, what's called Nefila. Nefila means it's categorically separated. It's removed. Removed in such a way that there's no capacity to reverse the steps and to see how this Chochma came from the other Chochma. There's a Lashon Gemara, which is brought in Chassidus. The Gemara says, and Abakiva said, this is the story about the Arba Shenichas Olapandis. Kishetagiyah la'avnei shayesh tahir al teimru mayim mayim. It's a really, the whole Gemara Chagiga is very exotic. It's Kabbalah. When you will reach avnei shayesh tahir, stones of shayesh. Shayesh means marl. That are tahir, that are clear, that are pure, that are transparent. Don't say water. I'll tell you my. And in Chassidus alone, there's more than one interpretation. There's a lot of them, Sifrei Musar and Sifrei Drush, explain what this Gemara means. So Chassidus says like this: there's something called Chochmei Law and Chochmas HaTorah. Chochmei Law is Chochmas HaTorah. The higher Chochma of Torah. Chochmat HaTorah is called the Chochma of Ma'aseh Bereishis. The lower Chochma, that means the way the Torah talks about the world. Not about how the world talks about the world. And it says, Asora Akaf, that the Chochma of Ma'aseh Bereishis, the lower Chochma, comes from the Chochma of Torah, which is the higher Chochma. And the Gemara says, when you go to the Shadish of Chochma, don't say Maya. Don't say that there's two orders, there's two Chochmas. In other words, the way the Chochma Tata is included in the Chochma Law, it's one and the same. The Chochma of the Torah that talks about the world is actually the same Torah that talks about the 10 utterances of creation, is the same Torah which is associated with the 10 commandments. So all Chochma comes from Torah. The way Chochmas Ha'olam is in the Torah, the way the Torah talks about world, that's not Chitzonius, because it's full of Eibush. The way Chochma of Klippa talks about the world, it's called Chitzonius, because there's an Ephilon, there's a Shvira, and there's a break between the Chochmas that is in the Torah and the Chochmas that happen in the There's a famous story with the Frierdiker Rebbe, which I happen to be learning now in the Sikha that I'm teaching men, called Inyana Shel Torah Chasidus, on the essence of Chasidus. And one of the many points that Rebbe brings over there is that somebody once said to the Frierdiker Rebbe that there are different political systems in the world. There's democracy, there's a monarchy, there's a faceless. Oh no, I don't even know what they all called. Yeah, and of course there's one called anarchy. There's different systems of politics. Which is the closest to Torah? That what the Frierdiker Rebbe was at. So the Frierdiker Rebbe said, all chochmas in the world have a little emes. The emes in each chochma comes from Torah. So each political system is going to have aspects that are going to be reflective of Torah because they're the Torah the way it's in that chochma. But all in all, it's very difficult to sieve out. In other words, every chochma is klipa, it's chitzonius. There's a kernel of truth in this, there's a kernel of truth in this. Each kernel of truth is the aspect of that political system which is actually part of chochmas HaTorah, but it's the way that chochmas HaTorah is b'derech nefila. It's found in that other chochma. So this is what the Alter Rebbe is teaching us. Chochmas chitzonius is not only mitam hameach, chochmas chitzonius is mitam halech. But that's what it says in Chazal. It's the divarta bon. A person is supposed to learn Torah. The labor is what it Torah. And the person shouldn't say, I already completed the whole Torah. It's a Gemara. It's Allah and Chanara. I learned the whole Torah. Eilech ve'helmet chochmes ha'umes. I already did it all. I know kol ha'shas. Mit ganz in Shalom. Ich hab alles gelernt. And now I'll learn. So the Gemara says, don't. Besides for all the other Inyan, the koch of a Yid, the passion of a Yid, the heart of a Yid, has to be a divrei Torah. In other words, even if the other issues are non-issues for you, for whatever reason, you're a very pure neshama, you're not mispoiled from chochmah, but the koch of a Yid has to be in Torah. There's a need for chochmas chitzenius, but just like the chochmah itself is chitzenius, the involvement of the Yid in it has to be be'efen chitzenius. And of course, the Alter Rebbe's point in context is that you need a tahara. Just like in all of this Pedic, the Alter Rebbe is talking about things, for the most part, besides for the first few lines, that are not evil, they're not Avedas, but they're also not Tahir. And when the Neshama goes from this world to the next world, there has to be a process of cleansing. Lishka chizu dahai alma. It's not enough to go to Gan Eden. You have to totally forget how this world looks, because the old image, the old approach, the old system interferes with the new. This applies also, and in one aspect, especially to Chochmas Umis. And I'm going to leave the last couple of lines for next week or next time in Mitzvah. Okay? Good morning. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
It's a tangential question.
Yes.
So when the shamas go, I'm assuming if the longer a person isn't in this world, the higher they rise.
Right.
So then does that mean that they're not involved with family?
See, this is so interesting. You're asking a very good question. When I was young, I got into so much trouble. I was young and very, very intelligent and very, very stupid. I was asked to speak at a shloshim. And my whole speech was about how the neshama goes away. They were so upset with me. I was stupid. The Rebbe, our Rebbe, gives a whole different angle. But he gives it so simply and so categorically and so absolutely. And I don't know what his source is. You know, the beginning of it is what you have, what the Frierdiker Rebbe said by the Rebbe's wedding. And it says in Zoya, the source of it is in Zoya, that when a person gets married, 3 generations before, that means parents and grandparents, come to participate in the chasna, to bless the zug and so forth, and sometimes it's mer noch mer, more and even more, which is why the Frierdiker Rebbe said Chassidus going back to the Alter Rebbe. Now wait, there's a residual of that. That when our Rebbe was Kabbalah Nesius, in the first Maimed, he started with the Alter Rebbe. And then Shabbos, he made another Fabregge. And he said, I said to myself, why did I start only with the Alter Rebbe, not with the Baal Shem Tov? The teretz is because by the Maimon of Chassaneh, the Rebbe, the Friedrich Rebbe started only with the Alter Rebbe. And then the Rebbe said a second Maimon, Hayeshevet Baganim. And he included the Baal Shem Tov in the Magid. And from that point on, in every Maimon, he would go back to the Baal Shem Tov. Now, between me, you, and this pushke, this piece of doiner, it's a Poshet Zach. This is the difference between the Rebbe and the Friedrich Rebbe. The Friedrich Rebbe is Mesachas to the Alter Rebbe, and the Rebbe is Mesachas to the Baal Shem Tov. Why? I don't know how to say this nicely, so I'll say it bluntly, because there's nobody else. The Baal Shem Tov came to the Rebbe and said, why didn't you mention me about Stilagani? So the Rebbe said, what do you mean, why? I'm Chabad. Chabad goes to the Alter Rebbe, and the Baal Shem Tov says, no, you're not Chabad anymore, you used to be Chabad. Now you're Chassidus. And Chassidus goes to the Baal Shem Tov. That's my own take. Take it or leave it. But that's how I understand what the Rebbe said. Baal Shem Tov came to the Rebbe, you make a Maimon Chassidus. You don't mention me in the Maggid. So the Rebbe says Chabad, and Baal Shem Tov says, no, Chabad is Gerezel. It's the Chassidus and Chabad are synonymous. They're the same. What are they saying? So the Rebbe mentioned Baal Shem Tov. From the Baal Shem Tov, the Rebbe, every Maimon after that, and the Rebbe used to sing the Gunim, also went back to the Baal Shem Tov. So this is the effect of this. The problem is this by tzaddikim, yes. There are so many letters and so many sikhs of the Rebbe, where the Rebbe makes it absolutely clear that our loved ones, even after an Elam Emes for decades, feel us and see us, and they're involved in our lives, and they rejoice in our happiness, and they're saddened by our sadness, and they're me'irach for us. The Rebbe makes it very physical, which seems to be a very big contradiction to the ideas that you've learned in Kabbalah. And I must tell you, I have never learned Kabbalah, and I don't regret not learning Kabbalah. But Chassidus brings it. The second Maimon in Samach Vov has a section dedicated to this inyan. That's really my primary source. And this Tanya brings it, and everything and that. There's different places in Chassidus where they talk about what happens to the neshama when it leaves. And it seems to be a constant that the best thing that happens for us, the best thing that happens to our body is that it should decompose as quickly as possible. And the best if should in a shoma, they should leave the space of the physical universe and go to Lamaila and have nothing to do with this world. Finished, done, over, beginning. Forget it. And here the Rebbe who talks about this in a whole different light, that our predescendants, right, are with us and they see us and they relate to us.
It's a
So,
Rashi. It's a Rashi from last week.
what's the Rashi?
So it's a tzaddikim. Rather than talking about fill the page of the.
Yeah, but we're not talking about tzaddikim. He's talking about the office, not tzaddik. Talking about the office. So the Rebbe says it about everybody's father and mother, and grandfather and grandmother. Push it to mention. Tzaddikim is another, and you said tzaddikim doesn't even say this. Aveis ha'elam, Rav Yitzchak and Yankiv are not just samazoi. Tzaddikim. Okay, so the answer to your question is, what the Rebbe says is true. How do you reconcile it says in Kabbalah? I have no clue. And that's the honest truth. I don't know. Okay, let's take a break and do a yen game, okay?